Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. And today we're going back in time, back to the age of conquistadors.
Ooh.
It's a period full of ambition, exploration, but also, a lot of brutality.
A lot of brutality.
And we're going to be talking about a figure today that you may not know, but who really had a big impact on the history of Central America. Pedro de Alvarado.
Yeah, Pedro de Alvarado is he's a fascinating figure. He embodies that dual legacy of the conquistadors.
Right.
Where on the one hand, yeah, they were conquistadors. On the other, they were city founders, military strategists.
Yeah.
And they were operating in a world that was very different from our own. They were driven by this thirst for gold,
Right.
this desire to spread Christianity, and often a belief in their own cultural superiority.
Yeah, so I think, for a lot of our listeners who maybe haven't heard of Alvarado before, let's give them a little bit of background. Like, where does his story begin?
Well, so Alvarado was born in Badajoz, Spain, around 1485. And this wasn't just some, sleepy little village. Badajoz was this really bustling hub right on the border with Portugal.
Oh, wow.
Full of military activity, full of trade. And you can imagine young Pedro growing up surrounded by all this energy, maybe dreaming of adventure, beyond the borders of his little town.
Right, and he finds it.
He finds it.
By 1519, he joins Hernan Cortez's expedition to Mexico.
Right.
I mean, that puts him right in the heart of
Yeah.
the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire.
Absolutely. And Alvarado quickly proves himself to be a very capable leader.
Yeah.
He rises through the ranks to become one of Cortez's most trusted captains. And so he's there during that pivotal moment, the Spanish entry into Tenochtitlan,
Wow.
grand Aztec capital. And, you can just imagine what that must have been like for them.
I was just thinking that. It must have been...
It must have been mind-blowing, this city, unlike anything they'd ever seen.
Mhm.
This blend of awe and probably a good dose of fear as well.
It must have been just a massive culture clash.
Oh, absolutely.
Like happening right before their eyes.
Yeah, and I think, speaking of Alvarado, he had this reputation for ruthlessness.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how that played out in Tenochtitlan.
Well, so that leads us to the infamous Matanza de Toxcatl. In 1520, Cortez had left Alvarado in charge of Tenochtitlan.
Oh.
And during an important Aztec religious festival, Alvarado orders an attack on Aztec nobles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He was fearful of a rebellion. He thought that they were going to rise up against him.
So this was a preemptive strike.
Exactly. But what ends up happening is that this preemptive strike sparks the very uprisings that he was trying to prevent.
Oh, the irony.
Right. And this ultimately contributes to the Spanish retreat from Tenochtitlan, which becomes known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows.
It seems like, I've always heard that Alvarado was very impulsive. And I'm wondering, was that his personality or was that kind of a trend that we see with the Spanish at the time? That's a really good question. And it's probably a combination of both. We can't downplay Alvarado's personality. He definitely had a tendency to be impulsive. But we also have to understand the context of the time, right?
Yeah.
The Spanish were deeply suspicious of native rituals. They saw them as pagan.
Of course.
And potentially threatening to their own, beliefs.
Right.
And so this fear, combined with Alvarado's own tendencies, resulted in this really disastrous event.
So after this pretty violent chapter in Tenochtitlan, where does Alvarado go next?
Well, so Alvarado sets his sights on Guatemala.
Okay.
In 1523, he leads a force of Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies, which is interesting, to conquer this new land. But again, it's not a peaceful takeover.
Right.
He faces fierce resistance from various Mayan groups, especially the Quiches.
Yeah, imagine. I mean, they're not just going to give up their land,
No.
Without a fight.
Exactly.
This must have been a very difficult campaign for him.
Oh, absolutely. It was grueling. And the Battle of Quetzaltenango is a key turning point.
Okay.
Alvarado's forces, they have their indigenous allies, and they also have superior weaponry, right? They've got the guns, they've got the cannons.
Yeah, technology is really on their side.
Exactly. And so they win a decisive victory, which paves the way for the capture and execution of Quiche leaders and the burning of their capital, Kumarkash.
Oh, wow.
It's a brutal chapter, for sure.
It seems like destruction kind of followed him wherever he went. But I know that he also founded a city, right?
He did.
He wasn't just all about conquest.
Yeah, so that's another aspect of Alvarado's complex legacy.
Right.
He was a destroyer, but he was also a creator.
Right.
In 1524, he found Santiago de los Caballeros de Guatemala, which marks the start of Spanish dominance in the region.
So it's like this constant interplay of violence and creation.
Exactly, yeah. It's really hard to reconcile those two sides of him.
It's a reminder that history is messy.
It is messy.
It's not always clear-cut, and it's not always easy to categorize people.
Absolutely. And so Guatemala falls under his control, but Alvarado's ambition clearly doesn't end there.
Of course not. Where does he go next?
He sets his sights on El Salvador.
El Salvador. Wow, so he's really making his way across Central America. What happens there?
So in 1525, he clashes with the Pipiles, another indigenous group, in the Battle of Acayutla. And this was another really fierce fight, and Alvarado himself was wounded in the battle. He actually sustained a pretty serious leg injury.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize he'd been injured in battle.
Yeah, it was a tough one. But even with that setback, he was pretty determined.
He doesn't give up easily.
No, not at all. And ultimately, he subdues the Pipiles and founds the city of San Salvador, expanding the Spanish Empire even further.
So it's almost like, he gets knocked down, but he gets back up again and just keeps going.
Exactly. He just keeps pushing forward.
Yeah, and then, of course, we have to talk about Honduras.
Yes, Honduras. So in 1536, he heads to Honduras with a pretty sizable force. And it wasn't just about expanding territory this time.
Oh.
There were all these squabbles happening among the conquistadors themselves.
Oh, so even amongst all this, conquest and expansion, there was still infighting and power struggles going on.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The conquest wasn't this, unified, harmonious effort.
Right.
These were ambitious, often ruthless individuals, all vying for power, vying for wealth.
Right.
And so Alvarado gets sent in to basically settle things down and solidify Spanish control in Honduras.
Oh, so he's kind of like the enforcer.
Exactly. He's the guy they send in to bring order.
And I'm guessing he probably did it in a pretty, forceful way.
Well, yeah, I mean, in typical Alvarado fashion, his intervention in Honduras isn't just about, peacekeeping.
Yeah.
He also ends up founding another city, San Pedro Sula,
Of course.
which further cements the Spanish presence in the region.
So, we've talked about Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. Mm-hmm. This guy really covered a lot of ground in a very short amount of time.
He did.
And, his impact on the region, it's undeniable. But it's also important to remember that his story is not just one of conquest and city building.
Right.
But it's also a story of immense violence and destruction.
Absolutely. And, it's important to remember that the world Alvarado stepped into wasn't this peaceful paradise, right?
Yeah.
Pre-Columbian Mesoamerican societies, while advanced in many ways, also had practices that the Spanish considered barbaric.
Like what?
Well, human sacrifice, for example, was a deeply ingrained ritual in many of these cultures.
I think that's something that we, as modern people, we tend to forget.
Right.
Like, these societies weren't perfect and they weren't always peaceful.
No, they had their own internal conflicts,
Right.
their own, practices that we might consider, horrific by today's standards.
And that's where things get complicated, right?
They do.
Because the Spanish, including Alvarado, they used this practice, human sacrifice, as a justification for conquest.
Yeah.
They claimed to be on a mission to eradicate this barbarity and bring Christianity to the heathens.
Right, right. It was a very convenient justification, wasn't it?
It was.
It allowed them to to frame their actions as this righteous crusade rather than, this brutal grab for power and resources.
Which is what it really was, I think it's safe to say.
Well, yeah, I mean,
it's a pattern that we see throughout history, sadly.
it is, religion as a shield for conquest and exploitation.
But we can't deny that the arrival of the Spanish did ultimately lead to the end of human sacrifice in the region.
Right. It's a very complex and uncomfortable truth.
You did.
That forces us to kind of grapple with the nuances of history.
It's easy to judge from our modern perspective, but we have to acknowledge that the world operated very differently back then.
Absolutely. And it's within this knot of complexities that we find Alvarado's legacy, right?
Okay, I'm interested to hear more about that.
Okay, so, on the one hand, he was this driving force in the Spanish conquest of Central America, right?
Yeah.
He left behind this trail of destruction.
Of course.
But on the other hand, he founded cities that still stand to this day.
So it's complicated.
It's very complicated. And so I guess the question is, beyond the immediate impact of the conquest, the violence, the destruction, what about the long-term consequences? Are there any aspects of Alvarado's legacy that we could consider positive?
It's fascinating to think about how these figures like Alvarado were driven by their ambitions,
Yeah.
the beliefs of their time,
Right.
and they kind of set in motion all these events that continue to have repercussions even centuries later.
Absolutely. And, it reminds us that history isn't just about these dates and these battles,
Right.
but it's about the choices that people made,
Right.
the actions that they took, and these unintended consequences that just rippled outward, shaping the world we live in.
Yeah, and we've talked about the cultural exchange, the introduction of technologies, ideas, but there's also this other layer to those unintended consequences, and that's the impact on the environment.
Oh, absolutely. That's huge. The founding of cities, the construction of roads and all the infrastructure, the
Yeah.
transformation of the land for agriculture. I mean, these things had a profound and lasting impact on the environment.
Yeah, it's almost like they were reshaping the landscape of Central America.
Exactly. And those changes, I mean, we can still see them today. The cities they founded are now these bustling urban centers.
Right.
The crops they introduced are still being cultivated.
Wow.
The languages they spoke are still spoken. It's amazing. It's like this reminder that history isn't just this thing that happened in the past.
It's still with us.
Yeah, it lives on. It's woven into the fabric of our world.
It really makes you wonder, if Alvarado could come back and see Central America today,
Yeah.
would he even recognize it?
I mean, who knows, right? But
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say that the reality is far more complex and nuanced than anything that he could have ever imagined.
Yeah, I think so too. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the life and legacy of Pedro de Alvarado, what's the one thing you really hope our listeners take away from this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that history is rarely black and white.
Yeah.
Figures like Alvarado, they were products of their time. They were driven by a really complex mix of motivations.
Right.
And their actions had both devastating and transformative consequences.
Absolutely.
And it's up to us to really wrestle with that complexity, to learn from it, and to hopefully use that knowledge to create a more informed and just future.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's been such an interesting journey exploring this really tumultuous period in history. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep digging deeper.
Yeah.
Keep asking questions.
Absolutely.
And keep exploring that rich and often challenging tapestry of the past.
Because ultimately, understanding history is about understanding ourselves, our world, and the forces that have shaped who we are today.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring.